Good evening. We will now get started with tonight's program. Thank you for joining us as we host another talk in the 2021 academic year that is part of the annual East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, sponsored by the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. My name is Paul Kopp, and I am Associate Professor in Chinese Religion and Thought in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. For more information on the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies and the East Asia by the Book CEAS Author Talk series, please visit the CEAS website and subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails. These links will be provided in the chat box. We are encouraging book sales for this event to be made through the Center's longtime partner and co-sponsor of the series, the Seminary Co-op Bookstores. The first not-for-profit bookstore whose mission is bookselling. Although the stores remain closed to the public, they are fulfilling orders through their website. We are encouraging visitors to visit their website and help support this unique cultural institution. Links to the co-op and to the page for tonight's book will be made available in the chat box. Following the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session moderated by Kenneth Pomerantz, University Professor of History here at the University of Chicago. To ask a question to be addressed during tonight's Q&A portion of the program, please be sure to type in your questions into the Q&A box. Our speaker tonight, Martin Powers, is Professor Emeritus of the History of Art at the University of Michigan. He was formerly Sally Michelson Davidson Professor of Chinese Art and Cultures and Director of the Center for Chinese Studies at Michigan. Both of his first two books, Art and Political Expression in Early China and Pattern and Person, Ornament, Society, and Self in Classical China, were awarded the Levinson Prize for Best Book in Pre-20th Century Chinese Studies. His latest book, China and England, the Pre-Industrial Study for Justice in Word and Image, the subject of his talk tonight, was published by Routledge early last year. In addition, together with UChicago's own Dr. Catherine Zhang, he co-edited the volumes Looking at Asian Art and the Blackwell Companion to Chinese Art. In addition to teaching at Michigan, and I should note also here at the University of Chicago, Professor Powers has taught at Tsinghua University, Peking University, and Zhejiang University, and has published articles and essays in multiple venues in Chinese, including an editorial series in the Journal of Culture and Current Affairs, Dushu. In 2009, he was a fellow in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. And please let us now give a warm, if remote and silent, welcome to Professor Powers.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that generous introduction, and thanks to Ken for the invitation. I'm truly honored by this, and thanks to all the colleagues who are tuning in, as it were. I'm going to share the screen. It looks like I'll have to go through this again. Okay. Can you see the slides now? Yes? Okay. So I'll begin. Oops. So this book is about China's forgotten role in the history of social justice debate in England during the 18th century. To provide context for the book, we might ask why China's role was forgotten. John Stewart's book, entitled America Teacher's Edition, unexpectedly provides a clue. Notice the foreword by Thomas Jefferson. The book is a parody of the misinformation one finds in Western civilization and Chinese civilization textbooks. On page 4, we encounter a timeline of democracy beginning with Stonehenge. When we get to the 9th century, we read Chinese developed gunpowder, banking, newspapers, advanced medicine, paper money. Not Western, doesn't count. If you got the joke, it's because you understand that all too often that is the case, that important developments in Chinese history somehow don't make their way into the civilization textbooks. J.M. Blount revealed how China's role in global history has been systematically suppressed in popular histories by Eric Jones, Jared Diamond, and 6 other authors, including Max Weber. He reviewed their arguments in conscientious detail. He did a very good job, then exposed their shocking ignorance of Asia and reliance on popular stereotypes as if they were fact. My impression is that it was the California school, including our own Ken Pomerantz, using facts, figures, and demographic data that first gained serious attention of historians of Europe. And this has improved the situation for the entire field. Yet for the period of the Enlightenment and all the rhetoric about human rights that goes with it, the grand narrative remains dominant. Despite decades of research by both Europe and China historians, a great deal of good work has been done, especially by British historians, documenting extensive cultural exchange during that period. Nonetheless, China typically doesn't make its way into the narrative, at least not the Enlightenment narrative. So that was the context, and that was in the back of my mind as I was working on the book. And I had hoped to make some contribution to this very fine body of literature that's already out there. I won't summarize the entire book. Instead, I'll introduce a few basic assumptions, then provide examples of primary sources and how they're used in the book to give a sense of the method. Most of the book consists of close readings of primary sources, many of them visual, some of them verbal or literary. So the book argues that many social topics we thought were unique to the West are structural and so likely to arise in some form in many societies. The problem of the multitude versus the political center, for example, either the multitude can participate in national policy to some degree or it can't. There aren't too many other options. The monopolization of national resources by the privileged few. Political structure normatively either enhances or inhibits oligarchic control. How to deal effectively with real problems facing state policy is normatively either fact-based or fantasy-based. For example, in Song Times, there was a great deal of emphasis on shi, whether it had to do with the examination system or evidence for policy. Whereas in Tong Times, religions perhaps more often got into the mix than later on. The core argument centers around 5 rubrics of analysis with respect to pre-industrial China and England. The aim is not to identify essentialized differences. In fact, I thoroughly reject any kind of a Volksgeist type notion. English reformers, in fact, and Chinese reformers alike sought to find ways to check the power of the privileged and extend prosperity to a broader sector of the population. I argued that throughout the 18th century, the ideals of English radicals and those of Chinese radicals, beginning with especially in the Tang Song transition, converge more and more. Now, in terms of method, apart from the usual techniques available to historians, the book makes use of translingual analysis inspired by Lydia Liu's work on modern China. But this book reverses the direction of travel, focusing on Chinese edicts and policy documents that have been translated into French and English. I begin actually, the earliest documents would date to around the 1660s or 70s, and I deal with a number of works from there on. But the most important of these were published in J.B. Dodd's History of China. You see the frontispiece here. It's a huge 2-volume compendium loaded with information about China, much of it reasonably accurate for the time. But I focus on the so-called imperial collection of edicts, ordinances, remonstrances, and so on, published with this book in the 1730s. And as you can see, that collection, which was ordered by Kangxi, was actually a compilation of works that had been published in Song Times. And these focused mainly on Han and Song dynasty sources. There's a section on Tang Taizong also, which means that English and probably French reformers who were very much interested in this volume of political essays were getting their understanding of Chinese political structure from Han and Sung sources, not so much from Qing dynasty sources. Okay, of course they had reports of Qing practice from the Jesuits, but my sense is that many of them were looking at these documents and drawing conclusions from them. Samuel Johnson, who was enormously influential, I like to call him the Su Dongpo of 18th century England, wrote a book review of this collection, this imperial collection. And so it was very widely read and quite influential. Let me give you an example of what one can do by way of translingual analysis with these kinds of texts. So one of the policy documents translated was by Zheng Dexiu. And the theme of that essay is Gongyi, public opinion, which had been institutionalized in the grievance offices, not to mention in other forms at that time, and was considered a very important part of political theory at the time, which is why Zheng Dexiu devotes a whole essay to it. But Europeans apparently did not quite have a clear concept of this at that time. They certainly had public opinion. If you read Spectator, you know that there was public opinion, but that doesn't mean it had been problematized or theorized to the degree that it had been in Song China. So in this passage, the first line, as is often the case, actually, the translations overall, I would say, are quite good. They're not fanciful. They run into problems when they encounter a novel political concept, as here, or when the Chinese political idea is too radical and they don't dare to translate it. But this first line you can see is beautifully translated. It's a common and true saying that there is in the universe a particle of unextinguished reason rooted in the heart of man. If you see that, if you can read that Chinese, you realize it's pretty close. But when you go on from there, they say, which being at all times the same as the cause of certainty, that's not what it says. It says that particle of reason is in fact public opinion. And then it goes on to say fairly accurately that, throughout history, there have been times when there was so much wickedness and disorder that people dared to contravene every law and civil norm of society, which is close to the Chinese text. But then this, again, completely misses it. What the Chinese says is, and although this disorder was able to prevent public opinion from circulating in society, it was not able to prevent public opinion from existing in the hearts of men. As you can see, that was completely missed. So it strikes me, if public opinion had been a modern Western concept, as we're always told, why is it that Westerners could not understand it when they first encountered it? And this goes for a good many other concepts, Western concepts as well. I also conduct what you might call visual analysis, arguing that at certain moments in history, at many moments in history, particularly in advanced societies, there's a tendency to try to visualize complex political concepts. In fact, Thomas Hobbes recommended, he said, you can't understand something as abstract as the polity without figures and images. And so the frontispiece to his book provides that. Well, in China also, you get the first visualizations of the polity in Song times. And so I compare these, not again to find essentialized differences, but differences at particular historical moments. So Hobbes' Leviathan allegorizes the polity in ways that reveals its constituent parts. Prior to that, portraits of the king or queen would have sufficed to represent the idea of England or France. The queen has some attributes, this reference to the navy, for instance, but basically the portrait of the queen and the representation of England are more or less the same thing. In Hobbes' frontispiece, which has been studied by many, and I rely especially on Daniel Ellen's Chicago colleague on her analysis, you could see that the two pillars of the state are the church and the military. There's no reference to a civil administration. And then in this section, we have a reference to the land, the territory of England, to the church again. Churches dot the landscape. Justice, or the power of the sword, sovereignty, royal blood. And Hobbes, as I think most of you know, was very much concerned with the problem of the multitude and the fact that the multitude basically is a kind of rabble where everyone has their own opinion, disparate opinions. And he argues that you can't run a country like that. You have to have a unified opinion, and that is the opinion of the king. And so we see the people here turned away from us. We see only their backs, so they have no individuality. If the king moves his arm, they have to move. If he doesn't move his arm, they cannot move. And that's pretty much how Hobbes imagined it. He cannot be accused by any of his subjects of injury. He cannot be punished by them. He is judge of what is necessary for peace and judge of doctrines. He is sole legislator and supreme judge of controversies and of the times. Oddly, Bai Juyi, in his policy document on law, Hao Ling, noticed the same problem, namely that the multitude has all kinds of different opinions. He says, according to the annals, people's minds are all different, just like their faces. Therefore, one person, one point of view, 1,000 persons, 1,000 points of view. Sounds pretty individualistic, actually. If you don't unite them with law, then each person's mind will differ entirely from every other. So you might think he's going to say, well, the emperor has to decide what you're going to think, but he doesn't do that. For example, if laws are applied strictly to the poor, but loosely to the rich, then they're not uniform, meaning they're not equal, obviously. If laws are enforced for people who are distant from the throne, but are not enforced for those near to the throne, then they're not uniform, they're not equal. So he doesn't ask that the people change their subjectivity or opinion at all, but rather that the state should apply laws in a uniform manner, and that will unify the people. Now, this assumption that everyone has a different opinion actually informs this painting on the left, which I consider to be a representation of the polity. It's a Song court painting. I think it probably dates to Song Gaozong's reign, and therefore it has to do with the passing of the mandate. The moment depicted is Tang Xuanzong's departure from the capital in times of chaos. He runs to Sichuan to take refuge, where he meets up with the rural people, and they demand that the mandate go to his son, Li Heng, the future Su Zong. Now you'll notice that in this painting, you have China, the empire, you have reference to the landscape, to the empire. You also have the emperor, you have military officials, as in a reference to the military, as in Hobbes. You also have civil officials, which Hobbes doesn't have. There's no reference to religion at all. You have the people, and the people are all looking at the king, just as in Hobbes' case. And you'll notice that in this case, you could see most of their faces, except for those who are facing directly away from us. Everyone is looking at Xuanzong here, and everyone's facial expression, if you could see it up close, is different, and everyone's gesture is different. Some go down on one knee, some on two knees, some merely bow as you would to a neighbor, clasp their hands. Others don't bow at all. Everyone is completely individual in their response, suggesting that it's spontaneous. I believe it has to be this way, because if this is the mandate, then it has to come spontaneously from each individual. The emperor can't come in and order that to happen. Now, in this particular case, because it's based on Sima Guang's history, Zizhi Tongjian, we know the story, and this local official, this Xiao Li, is lecturing the emperor on how he's messed up the empire and created misery for all these people, and that it came to things had come to this pass because he had not listened to criticism and advice from below. There's very much a Sima Guang kind of theme. Now, these differences, I would claim, are not serendipitous or accidental. They also are not in any way representative of any kind of national character, but they do have a lot to do with the moment when they were made. At this moment in China, first of all, there was a separation, formal separation between court and state. Secondly, there was no aristocracy to speak of. So the political situation was very different and from England. And in both cases, the way the polity is represented tells us something about that. Now, among the basic concepts, one of the most important is authority. Where does it come from? How do you explain it? Actually, in classical Chinese philosophy, as you all know, a lot of attention is given to this. Mozi, Mengzi, and bureaucratic theory, they're all very much concerned to determine where authority comes from. So this is one of the topics I discussed. So following on the work of Charles Tilly, chapter 3 suggests that due to structural constraints, there are basically two ways that authority can be conceived. Obviously, there are more than two, but these two tend to show up often in history. First, society is divided into groups based on religion, ethnicity, wealth, social class, and other hereditary factors. Groups are always ranked and privileges distributed according to rank. The highest ranking groups rule through the exercise of privilege, while the lower orders lack those privileges. This is what Charles Tilly calls an inequality generating system. The distribution of social goods is based on group membership. In the second method, government takes individuals as its object. So here you have a structural situation. There's either groups or individuals. I can't think of much in between, though maybe there is. And seeks to match talented individuals to the appropriate office. Of course, Eisenstadt, this would be Eisenstadt's bureaucratic society as opposed to his feudal society. This requires some system for testing and monitoring official performance, such as examinations, regular reviews, grievance system, and so on. Meritocracy is egalitarian when everyone is assessed according to the same standards. That is, when individuals are assessed according to the same standards. This is best accomplished when group membership is treated as irrelevant or even suppressed. For instance, by implementing standardized anonymous civil service examinations. If it's anonymous, they don't know if you're Khitan or if you're Chinese. They don't know if you're Buddhist or if you're Taoist. They don't know if you're rich or if you're poor. Now, the book argues that equality under the law can occur only when the influence of group membership on appointment or punishment, those two things are appointment or punishment, is seriously reduced. It can never be eliminated, right? A group membership is always there, but it has to be seriously reduced in order to approximate some kind of equality. Furthermore, it requires that everyone remain equal before the facts. That is what equality means, equality before the facts. And we're having a crisis in this country right now because some people don't agree with that. Due to the long-term influence of Aristotle's politics, European political theory often opted for the group-based system, since that was what Aristotle regarded as the source of political authority. It's interesting, in politics, at least in the 18th century version, he doesn't spend much time asking where authority comes from. It's obvious. It's also from natural causes, meaning from birth, that some beings command and others obey, that each may obtain their mutual safety. And this gets repeated in this document by the Parliament of Paris, in Sam Pufendorf, in many, many cases, just very incredibly influential in the early modern period. Authority was imagined, I would say, as a kind of substance, like gold or silver. Plato makes that comparison, in the blood, and the more of it you had, the more privilege you could exercise. Jonathan Israel describes this late 18th century world as one ruled by princes and nobilities and characterized by huge inequalities of wealth and legally buttressed privilege. It was privilege that provided the authority. The laws provided the buttressing. According to Israel, most people believed the world and everything in it were created by God, and the social order is divinely sanctioned. Hence, one pillar of the state is the church. And that's why in England, the main criteria for appointment to a magistracy was being noble and being Anglican. Not much else was needed. No Jinshur degree required. The nobility were the main, indeed the overwhelming source of administrative personnel. The old idea that the modern state rested on teams of bureaucrats of middle-class origin who had studied Roman law has been largely discredited. In some of these societies, and I would claim that post-Han and pre-Song China fits this description in many ways, were based on a specific notion of authority as distributed according to hereditary group membership. This is distinct from meritocracy, which takes individuals as its focus. Charles Tilly calls those sorting systems. Equality and meritocracy are not only related in principle, but in the early arguments for equality in England. Meritocratic administration, I think, is one of China's most important inventions. The key to classical bureaucratic theory was self-determination based on performance, or what came to be called Mingshi theory. You establish an office's legal jurisdiction and duties, what later were termed zhize and zhineng. You establish an office's legal jurisdiction and duties in writing and appoint someone you suspect is qualified. Then you make your decision based on his actual factual performance. Huainanzi states this very clearly. If criminals are executed, they do not resent the monarch because their punishment is a consequence of their own crime. If men are promoted, they do not feel they owe it to the monarch because this is the consequence of their own accomplishments. In this way, the people will know the source of promotions and punishments. They will know that it all depends upon their own persons. Now, it's very difficult for Europeans to understand the separation of political authority from social status in China, as we'll see shortly. European travelers repeatedly assumed that offices were granted as gifts at the monarch's pleasure, as was the case in Europe. But as you can see, early bureaucratic theory directly rejects that because you have to have the facts on the ground to justify the appointment. Moreover, this principle is taken for granted in latter Han pictorial art. One of the most popular subjects in Northeast China was the story of Confucius meeting the boy Xiang Tuo. The locus classicus for this story is the Huainanzi also. And from the Huainanzi, it's very clear what the point of the story is. This 7-year-old boy basically contradicted Confucius and corrected him. And Confucius accepted his arguments because they were reasonable. In other words, his low status as a child was irrelevant, and Confucius' high status as a great philosopher was irrelevant. What mattered were the facts. The boy is pointing in latter Han pictorial engravings that's the person with authority. The guy who's giving the orders, the guy with the authority is pointing. So to see a child pointing at Confucius here is quite remarkable and revolutionary. Writers, latter Han writers like Wang Fu and Wang Chong wrote long books with lots of criticism of the government, and they took it for granted that they had a right to do that. Although in some reigns, such as Han Wudi's, they might not get away with it. So these assumptions, according to Song historians, were not enforced very well after the Han and before the Song. But in the late Tang, we find them again. People like Liu Zongyuan, Bai Zhiyi, Han Yu begin to promote bureaucratic theory. I know they're supposed to be Confucian thinkers, I'm sure they are, but they knew their bureaucratic theory very well. And so we see these kinds of egalitarian assumptions coming back. Liu Zongyuan, in a private letter, says, do you know the office of all those who are officials on the land? Their duty is to be the people's servants, not to make the people serve them. Those who make their living on the land take 1/10 of their income, okay, that's their property, to hire officials, which makes me the equal of the official. Now, the tone of voice in the Chinese is wonderful here. The yu qi is great. 是思平于我, right? It's very defined. Because an official's authority came from the office and was contingent upon performance, an official was not conceived as having any intrinsic authority or status, at least not to Liu. Of course, in Tang times, he was the outlier. But by Song times, these assumptions made their way into the law. So for example, a law was passed under Song Taizu, which basically said that all taxpayers have equal status in a court of law. And this particular law was praised by people like Sima Guang and Hu Hong. Sima Guang remarked that both landlords and tenants as taxpayers are equal under the law. 辩护起民, right? In a court of law, no one is in a position to lord it over the other. That's a pretty good definition of equality. Hu Hong, writing in the 12th century, even if it's the emperor himself, officials must protect the people with their babies under the law. It doesn't matter if these were always enforced. I doubt their courts were any better than ours, as many corrupt judges as we have. But to have these kinds of statements become normative at this time, certainly we'd never hear the end if this had been spoken in 11th century England. Now, this is one of the translated, this again is another passage from Sima Guang from one of the translated policy documents, which refers back to the principles we saw in the Huainanzi. Again, that position in office should be egalitarian. It should be based on the facts of your performance. But again, there are some novel and radical conceptions which the translators tended to avoid. And again, this passage starts out pretty well. The great rule of sovereigns is to reward virtue and to punish vice, advancement of probity and merit, and to ban all who want both. You have no idea how radical that was in 738, where people would not dare to publish the name. Honors and posts, it mentions being the most precious of states. These are the normal terms for an office. They had trouble again coming up with a translation for zhi, guanzhi, and they normally called honors, dignities, posts, all of which refer really to social status rather than a bureaucratic position. However, the next few lines they miss totally. So it says, those give a rank and salary are given, it is the emperor's people who give them the rank and salary. It's not because the monarch them. And those who are punished, it is the empire because the emperor dislikes them. It's basically not public or not translated because I think it would be too dangerous in France at any rate to publish something like that. And then this last part, they pretty much fudge it. But I provided a translation. From this, it is evident that the monarch did not dare to display public opinion of the empire's people in favor of his own private opinion. And that message is very similar to the point of this painting, which is based on Sima Guang's history text. How about English reception? Okay, one of the first and most influential books to introduce Chinese notions to Europeans was Johann Neumann, Born China, which was translated into English in 1667. Or was a friend of his book on natural law, commenting on the Chinese meritocratic system. Neither do the Chinese express any honor for antiquity of descent. The poorest and meanest person in the empire is capable by his learning only of preferring himself to the highest places of honor. Notice that the first honor refers to social rank and the second to bureaucratic rank. He does not distinguish between the two. And this becomes clearer as he concludes. Nobility ought not to depend only upon the blood, which means, yes, it should depend upon the blood, but not entirely, and should much rather be raised and established upon virtue. Nobility refers to political authority. This is the standard translation for zhi from this time till the late 18th century, which means they did not separate political authority from this very clearly until you get to someone like Tom Paine or Rousseau. Now, what is this virtue he's talking about? In the 17th century, all noble families were engaged in a permanent competition, not merely to maintain their own standing, but if possible to rise in the hierarchy and to secure more status than their aristocratic rivals. So he's confusing the competition for social status with competition for public office. Chapter basically of the understanding of merit from the late 17th to late 18th century. An important that occurs with Samuel Johnson in his review of the Imperial Collection, as I mentioned, because here you can see his understanding is well beyond that of Pufendorf's. Someone reads the Imperial Collection, he'll be amazed to find that there's a country where nobility and knowledge are the same, where men advance in rank as they advance in learning, and promotion as the effect of virtuous industry. This rank clearly refers to administrative rank, and nobility still refers to authority, but it's based on learning. Where no man thinks ignorance a mark of greatness or laziness the privilege of high birth. So he's contrasting learning as against privilege and blood, basically hearing at privilege and blood. And this contrast you'll see reverberating in the works of Thomas Paine and Abbé Raynal 50 years later. In Chinese political theory is the notion of fallibility. The system of government that developed in Imperial China was based on the presumption that officials, the government and the emperor were all fallible and required feedback from official organs, but also from the people at large. That's why you have the Dongwen Jianyuan, Dongwen Guyuan, Yushitai, and institutes like that. And the Imperial Collection, those principles are stated early on. If you read 10 pages into the Imperial Collection, the translations, you're going to come across both of Han Wendi's edicts about essentially encouraging free and open criticism, first from the officials and then from the people at large. Again, we see that the most radical part was basically left out. Let it be the business of my people with utmost attention to examine into my conduct and inform me of my faults. That's all fine. But then the next part in blue is very much understated. This is a much stronger. Men of, I would translate it, men of ability, that is, you should choose men of ability and virtue who could admonish me by speaking honestly and with exceptional candor so as to remedy my deficiencies. Is much more meat. But nonetheless, the idea comes across, and especially in the following policy document by Jia Shirley, not the ministers of state, freely gave necessary and important advice, but even people in the highways and streets without any dread discoursed on what they disliked. That's pretty close to the Chinese. And the free thinkers refer to this passage, I believe. They don't quote it directly, but they refer to it, and so does François Quesnay and other Frenchmen. And again, this principle was taken for granted in Han Dynasty engravings, where you see evil or bad monarchs being criticized by their statesmen. By Song times, formal feedback mechanisms included circuit inspectors, grievance offices at all levels, the Department of Investigation, which impeached corrupt or abusive officials and criticized the emperor, private publications, essays, poems, and artworks exposing injustice. Of course, there were moments which Chen Dexiu mentions in that first policy document I introduced to you, such as under Wang Anshi Caijin, where all this was suppressed. Now here I want to make a point which is a leitmotif in the book. I do this several times, but tonight I'm only going to do it once. And that is, every time I think the reader might be tempted to say, oh, the Chinese were the first to do this, I try to remind them that these kinds of statements and sentiments can be found in many times and places. And often they appear spontaneously or in without knowing about one another. So for example, George Buchanan's argument that the people have a right to resist sovereigns themselves parallels Mencius' sentiments, but he could not have known of him. And in fact, the last chapter of the book consists of examples like this, parallel arguments, say between Spinoza and Zhuangzi, where not Spinoza and Zhuangzi, Spinoza and Li Zuqian, although they could not have known of one another. I think there's no translation of Li Zuqian even now, so Spinoza could not have known of it. But nonetheless, he comes up with a parallel argument. So I don't attribute any of this to national genius. The people is another important concept. There, as you know, Mencius makes it very clear that the government has a responsibility to the people, and that legitimate government is government that promotes the happiness and prosperity of the people. There's a method for gaining the support of the people, and that is to gain the hearts and minds of the people. There is also a method for gaining the hearts and minds of the people, and that is to give them what they desire and do not implement those policies that they detest. That is all. Can you imagine if Aristotle said that? We'd never hear the end of it. But not Western doesn't count. Mencius had a huge impact on Song law and Song policy and Song painting. So his notion of the mutual responsibility of taxpayers and government comes through in the poems of Lo Shou, which were reproduced more than once on imperial projects, painting and poetry. In this case, we have an imperial inscription. This poem is about taxes and tax paying. And here we have examples of the Min, the people, the taxpayers, and there's 3 women. Why? Because women were taxpayers also. They paid taxes on the silk that they produced, and the men paid taxes on the grain. And as taxpayers, of course, they had the right to go to the grievance offices or to bring suits to court. So this is a painting that specifically identifies the people as the taxpayers and also as the beneficiaries of good government. The poem references explicitly the meritocratic system of appointment and that this will benefit the women, and that's why they should pay taxes. There's no mention that you should do this because God wants you to do it or because His Majesty has royal blood. It's because you'll benefit from this. We also have paintings of people who suffer as a result of bad policy. This is just one example of 2 fisher children freezing in the cold, hungry, trying to catch some fish. Now, the reception, if we move to 16th century Europe, again, the attitude toward the people is very much Aristotelian, meaning that the multitude is to be ruled. They do not participate in the polity. And we've seen that before. Some of the earliest calls for something resembling statist intervention on behalf of the people appear to have come from the freethinkers, intellectuals with whom Samuel Johnson was familiar. In their exposures of inequality and corruption under the rule of Chancellor Walpole, Robert Walpole, the freethinkers cited China as a model so frequently that the historian Sir Leslie Stephen lampooned the practice as the argument from the Chinese. One of those early passages that we find in Neuhoff already comes from the Book of History. Emperor Yao exhorted Shun to govern like a father and to remember he was made for the people and not the people for him. People in this passage is very unusual in the context of 1667 England. It doesn't normally have that valence. Here it implies that the people are to be the recipients of good policies on the part of the government. The free thinkers made use of that passage, arguing that the prince should regard himself as made for the people's protection, not the people for his pleasure. And you'll notice that it's actually similar to Liu Zongyuan. Their duty is to be the people's servants, not to make the people serve them, although this would not have been available in English. The Morals of Confucius was a widely read text that provided summaries of key concepts from Confucius, the Mencius, the Great Learning, and other classical texts. It covered such topics as separating public and private interest, appointing men who are capable and dedicated to the public interest, and the government's responsibility to foster the happiness of the people. And you can see these are just some examples. It will be a happy and flourishing empire, govern and make them happy. They were the happiest people of the earth, designed only to make them happy, and so on. Louis Lecomte, writing just a few years later, this is also a leitmotif in his text. Gained the love and respect from the people, was become the darling of the people, beloved by the people, to whose happiness he contributed. In the Brooks edition of the Duald volume 1736, the translator recommended the mentioned concept, Minui Gui, that is, the people are the most important feature of the state, to Frederick, Prince of Wales. They recommended it to him as if this were a novel idea, which I believe it was. From the history of their emperors, you will find what you have long since learned, that's a polite phrase to keep their heads on their shoulders, that the most despotic power is no security to the supreme magistrate when he degenerates into a tyrant or discovers no regard for the public welfare, that goodness and clemency are the firmest support to the throne, and that the chiefest glory of the prince is to reign in the hearts of his subjects. All of these are called from translations from the Mencius. The entire book was paraphrased in that volume. What gets really radical is that Abbé Raynal, who Jonathan Israel calls the most influential radical writer of the late 18th century, takes this notion in his book on the Dutch Republic and makes it the core concept in forming a republic. Before this time, the word republic basically meant an aristocracy. Jefferson recognizes that. But here he applies this notion to legitimate government of a republic, and you come up with a more modern idea of the republic. So it took every opportunity to gain the love of his people, captivated the affections of his people, alienated the hearts and affections of his people, and so on. This then gets into Rousseau, and you can see it in many, many passages in Rousseau. So it becomes mainstream among the radical thinkers. You'll find it in Tom Jefferson all over the place and in Tom Paine as well. The earliest visual evidence of this that I can find in British prints, but I'm not an expert on British prints, so I suspect there are earlier examples, is this Hogarth print, 1762. In this print by Hogarth, London is burning. The king is valiantly working to put out the fire. Corrupt ministers are undercutting his efforts. And in the lower right, we see the miserable people who suffer due to bad government. So sort of similar to what you get in China. More about that in the book. So, getting close to the summary here, European response. And again, I'm only dealing with 18th century translations for the most part of French, if it's French or Latin or whatever. In other words, I'm interested in the discourse as it took place in England. I make no claims as to what was going on in France. Etienne de Silhouette is very important. In the 1730s, he was already publishing on China. And he says here, the Chinese recognize no nobility but that of virtue, and no rank but that pertaining to a man's office. This is radical, this is new, because you'll see that he understands that nobility, that is the authority, comes in the office. It comes through the office if you have the qualifications, namely virtue. He also understands that by this wise policy, they make flourish that commerce, which in most countries is ruined by the indolence of the nobility. So he links the prosperity to a meritocratic system as opposed to indolence. I mean, you can imagine, for example, if in our country, if it were being run by a bunch of indolent, incompetent people who were only interested in enriching themselves, this would tend to have a bad effect on the economy, right? Whereas if you had diligent officers in government who were competent and qualified, they could more easily deal with the pandemic and bring the economy back. Now, following upon the works of Duald and Silhouette, J.F. Mellon in 1736 brought out a second edition of his political essay on trade, in which he introduced a new chapter touching on China. And Mellon approved of the Chinese procedure of inviting comments and criticisms on government and administration from all citizens, presumably because this also helped commerce. In Silhouette's 1764 republication of his 1730s work, he described the imperial plowing ceremony along with several of China's most progressive policies. These were all Sung policies, by the way. And so this plowing ceremony came to be emblematic of China's progressive policies, which is why Joseph II actually carried out the ceremony, and so did Louis XVI. Among the policies he mentions are no nobility but virtue. We saw that. The government should adopt policies to stimulate industry and commerce, with meritocracy being one method to achieve that. Channels for popular complaint or feedback. Progressive taxes based on a national census and paid directly to the government. Jefferson recommends a progressive tax as a way of lessening inequality. I don't think Congress took the bait. Mandarins will make loans of oxen and seed to those farmers who need them. These are all Song Dynasty policies. So Europeans were getting their information about Chinese political theory and what they thought was practice from Han and Song documents. Yeah, I'll be done very quickly now. Neologisms from translated Chinese terms. Just to make it very quick, in Han and Song documents that were translated, the chief criterion for office was xianliang, and in Song times was xiande or caide. These were translated into merit and virtue, capacity and virtue, genius and virtue. These translations only appear in the imperial collection. They don't appear in the huge volumes of De Hault anywhere else, which suggests that they were actually translated from the Chinese. We find them in Sima Guang's document here, where he argues that these are the qualifications you need for good officials who will bring happiness and prosperity to the people. Thomas Jefferson makes a very similar argument in his bill for more general diffusion of knowledge. Again, you want men who are wise and honest, and who have genius and virtue, should be called to public service without regard to wealth, birth, or other accidental condition or circumstance. Both Sima Guang and Jefferson regard the people's happiness as the standard of good government. Both believe that the best way to promote the people's happiness is to recruit people who are public-spirited and capable. On the first page of Common Sense, Tom Paine identifies the happiness of the people as the standard of good government, calls for an end to hereditary authority, wants the power of official appointment removed from the monarch, and calls for formal checks. These are all Chinese policies that had been known for close to a century by this time. So in conclusion, the last chapter of the book looks at parallels in English, American, and Chinese political thought that could not have been due to translations from Chinese. Obviously, the translations were very important, but I picked cases where it couldn't have happened. Jefferson never read Zhuangzi, for example. It attempts to show that people in very different times and places can arrive at similar conclusions, particularly with regard to questions of social justice. And it is my hope that historians would move away from the notion of culturalism, culturally conditioned or culturally determined political ideals, and perhaps consider more the exchange of institutions, ideas, and even terms among nations at this time. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. I'm going to start. People should remember that they can ask questions through the Q&A box. I'm going to start off with a scattering of questions, some narrower, some broader, and take whichever one's. So I had one very narrow one, which is, I've never actually looked at the imperial collection in its European form. And I'm wondering if any of the quotations are dated. And if so, did it ever occur to the Europeans that, gee, these sources are very old. What are they saying these days?
Yeah, is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good one. And in fact, one could write a good half chapter at least on the mechanics leading to all this. Of course, they knew that a Han Dynasty edict was earlier than the Song Dynasty one, although people like the free thinkers didn't really care a lot about that. They just quoted Chinese texts. There actually is quite a bit of consistency between the sentiments expressed in the Han and the Song policy documents, especially because, as you know, Song scholars look back to the Han as a model. They were not interested in the Nanbei Chao and the Tang, or even in the Zhou, really. They saw the Han as the most rational empire, and that was their model. And Han Wendi's edicts were considered exemplary from Han times up to Kangxi. I mean, you have to understand that these essays, no later than Song, became basically the great books. These were exemplary and were recognized as such by everyone. What impressed the English and the French, based on their English translations at the time, is how radical this stuff was from a European perspective. I mean, you could actually question the king. You could actually, I mean, they read Wang Anshi, for example, and Wang Anshi is basically telling Shenzong that he's lazy, he's irresponsible, and so you could never say that to an English king. But I think what's behind your question is, did they ever ask, well, what about Qing? What about China today? Are they still doing this? And no, I haven't seen it. It could be, but I haven't seen much of that. They take these to be valid Chinese documents because they're the ones that do the work they need to have done.
Right.
People like Lecomte and Neuhoff do talk about Qing practice, of course, as you know, but they don't compare it to these documents that I know of.
That in some ways flows into a broader question that I wanted to ask, which is in listing the principles that the Chinese, at least in theory, do not use to choose officials. You mentioned religion. You didn't make a big deal of it in your talk. You talked more about social position, but religion is on the list too. And I found that striking partly because, right, there is another strand of Chinese radicalism, if you want to call it that, though it's not radical in the Chinese context, that the Europeans are aware of, which is, for lack of a better word, secularism.
Right. No,
I mean, as early as the 16th century, Galeota Pereira writes that, hey, they don't swear on anything.
Right.
When they testify in their court's work.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm partly interested in is what makes that a critique that can be widely known and makes it much, much harder for the critique of social privilege based on birth to be enunciated. Why can the Europeans get one of those things reasonably well, and they have a hard time with the other?
Yeah, no, that's a really handy the course. Thanks so much for that, Ken. And as you probably know, Jonathan Israel has written very insightful about this whole debate. I mean, many people have written about the Jesuit debate, but that's a little different. Israel has shown how, when Europeans realize, my God, that their whole natural system works, and their ethical system works without reference to God. Christian Wolff, of course, was impressed with that, and Voltaire. Voltaire mentions their tolerance quite a lot, and Israel argues that is essential for egalitarianism. Some people don't agree with him, but I see his point. He argues that as long as you admit religion, if you privilege one religion, how can you have an egalitarian system? Because right. So that certainly was important, and I reference Israel in the book on that topic, but I don't go into it a lot myself. But indeed, it goes together. Now, and it's true, they were incredibly insightful. So, for example, Malebranche understands the implication of the Chinese monist cosmos. He gets it. He disagrees. He thinks they're wrong, but he totally understands what they're saying. Whereas a concept of, well, you saw with Pufendorf, right? I mean, he's having so much trouble with the idea of authority that's in the office, that's not
Mhm.
part of the person's status, but it's in the office. And if you don't fulfill the terms of the office, you don't have authority. They really have, it takes about a century for them to get their heads around that. And I'm not certain, obviously they thought of authority and nobility as one and the same thing.
Mhm.
Why that's the case, I don't know, but it's useful, I think, that the linguistic analysis can show that. You can see it so clearly that he just doesn't get it.
Mhm. Okay, I could go on and on, but I just want to ask one more before I
Oh yeah,
open it up to
we
the
have to
floor.
have a virtual coffee sometime and go through all this.
Yeah, no, this is lots and lots of fun. And the question I want to sort of end with before we go to the questions from the floor is, you mentioned Leslie Stephen sort of parodying this as the argument from the Chinese, and the use of that phrase suggests that he already thought that you could render an argument outlandish.
Yes.
By specifying that its source was China.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could unpack a little bit how that comes to be true and that would have been acknowledged at the time.
Oh, wow. Maybe the first time makes reference to that. He says, when we Europeans began around the world, we quickly discovered that other people weren't as advanced as we didn't memorize it. We are aristocrats and they're barbarians. He says, but when we went to China, reports were coming back of these huge cities and this very advanced civilization, and people didn't believe it because they couldn't believe that anyone could be as advanced as we Europeans. But eventually they realized that this was true. And in other parts of his text, he refers to the fact that some people resent this. Okay, so some people admired China, but as you know, many people resented it, and they resented it because it stood as evidence, a refutation. China was basically a living refutation of white nationalist premises, if you want to put it that way, right, which drives a lot of people nuts even today. I actually wrote an op-ed about that for South China Morning Post a couple of months ago. And it kind of referred to Du Halde in that text. But yeah, it's very much with us, isn't it?
Okay, so let me take the first question from the floor, which says, comparing Chinese scholars such as Bai Juyi and Liu Zongyuan with Enlightenment thinkers, I'm wondering if Chinese scholars offer systematic social and political theories as Enlightenment thinkers did. For example, traditional Chinese society is commonly known as constituted by 4 kinds of people: scholar, official, peasant, artisan, merchant. How then does Liu Zongyuan's idea of officialdom figure in that picture?
Oh yeah, that's of course a very good question. And one of the sort of behind the question is our textbooks, which tell you that the, the 4 types of social group, which is really a, Jia Yi already tells us in Han times that nobody believes that anymore. Okay, so that theory was already considered old hat by the first, second century BCE. All right, but our textbooks give it to us for all of Chinese history. So that's part of what's going on here. No, Liu Zongyuan, in fact, was the first, Hurley Creel, our colleague here from Chicago, wrote about feudalism, of course, and he pointed out that Liu Zongyang was the first to write a really, I would call it a structural analysis, but Creel calls it a systematic analysis of feudalism.
Mm.
And he derives feudalism a little bit in a Hobbesian way from primitive conditions in primitive society. He sees it as evolving necessarily in order to survive. He also sees that it's a lousy system which perpetuates injustice and bad judgment and violence. And he says it needs to be replaced with a more meritocratic system. And yeah, he's got, he sees society again as one in which the multitude can hold whatever opinion they want. They will only do that naturally. And the government should not interfere with that. In fact, that's where the notion of public opinion comes from eventually. You have it in Han times, but it doesn't really develop until Song times, where that is a reality. Public opinion is a reality which the government has to somehow get its hands on. And they do that through these offices of the grievance offices that are at the county, provincial, and national levels. So people fit into the bureaucratic system. They fit into the administrative legal system in many ways. And there are multiple ways in which they can actually participate within limits in the administration. And that's all discussed in the book. Of course, it's a huge topic. But yes, I would say they have systematic theories. And I think maybe the quickest way to get to it is to have a look at some of Peter Bohl's essays. He has an article called Whither the Emperor, which is mainly about debates at the high levels of government, but it involves the taxpayers generally. And you also have these theories in that set of poems I mentioned by Lo Shou, which basically reinterprets the classical odes in modern terms so that you get rid of the aristocracy and the people fit in a manner which allows them to pursue their own interests. One other thing I would mention that I discuss in the book that might interest the person who asked that question is a chapter in Shen Kuo's Meng Xi Bi Tan, where he clearly sees the Song as post-aristocratic or post-feudal. So he says, you know, if you look around outside of China, all the countries have these hereditary families who are ruling families. And the people will only obey people who are from those families, and they won't obey commoners, no matter how smart they are. And he essentially gives a very good description of how an aristocracy works and how it has to do with people buying into the idea that these groups are noble and those groups are not. And he sneers at this and he says, well, you know, in China, we had that system too after the Han fell. He says, yeah, there's he blames the foreigners. I don't think that's quite what really happened, but he blames the Northern Way, essentially. Says that, you know, the foreigners brought it in. We never really had it, but they brought it in. And even then, it never really took root in China, he says. But he says outside of China, everybody has this kind of system. And of course, he's right. I don't know of any government outside of China at that time that didn't have an aristocracy of some sort. And then it's very clear, he says, this declined at the end of the Tang. And so it's obvious that me writing from the Song, I'm writing from a post-feudal period. And so there's no way they're going to just take the ideas from the Li Ji or something like that and apply it to society. They did take Mencius ideas, but Mencius ideas are much more flexible and are mainly concerned with the obligation of the government toward the people, not the other way around.
He's also got a book called This Culture of Ours, which has a wonderful chapter called For Perfect Order, which is about political theory and shows you in great detail just how systematic some of the leading thinkers at that time were.
Thanks, Ken.
So next question says, I'm interested in the pictures of suffering people. In your research, did you find a more pronounced presence of suffering people in certain genres of paintings than in others, or in certain periods? And how do you think the role of Buddhist picturing of suffering people fits to the Confucian, in quotes, secular, as just mentioned, depiction of people under duress?
Okay, again, a very rich question. I'll try not to go on too long. And one could do more research in that area. I don't claim that I have done enough. One of the things I point out is that when it comes to social injustice, and I think this is not just China, but maybe other countries, exposés appear in literature long before they appear in art. So for example, Du Fu is very outspoken in his exposés of injustice. There's nothing like that in Tang painting or sculpture that I am aware of. You might have Buddhist hells, but I don't think those are meant to be social protests. These are people who deserve to be suffering because they're sinners. But, and I argue that it shows up in art only when it becomes a topic of public discussion. And the reason being this, that a poet or an essayist can write as much as she needs to write to explain the topic. So if Du Fu's introducing a new topic like suffering people, which wasn't a new topic, but let's say it was, he has all the space he needs to say, well, here's what I mean by it, here's why it's important, and so on. An artist can't do that. An artist has to rely on the audience to recognize, oh, that's a suffering farmer, right? Which means that it's not going to happen until this becomes an object of public debate. So when you see suffering people in painting, that tells you something. That tells you that the artist could be confident that people would look at that and say, oh, that's a starving child. And, according to Mencius, that means that the government is doing a lousy job and so on. So I think that itself becomes a genre. It's a new genre in Song times. That is to say, the sort of suffering people, les misérables, if you want to put it that way. So it's not, and of course, by definition, these would fit into Minsu Hua, that is to say, paintings of ordinary life. But I think this is a subgenre within that. And you'll find it on fan paintings so that people would be fanning themselves in a bar or a tea house with a painting of a starving child, okay, a starving ox, those starving or those freezing fisher boys. They seem to be more common in the Song, but they're also quite common in the Ming. They're still quite, and in Ming times you get them in print, and you get other kinds of social pushback in Ming times, such as the Shui Hu Zhuan, the water margin playing cards, which one of my students has written a book about, which of course tend to be anti-government. And there they are, they're playing cards. So instead of having kings and queens and jacks, as we have, you've got these anti-government tropes in the playing cards, but you also have reportage, and I'm interested about that. That is to say, sometimes a reference to bad government could be conveyed metaphorically through, say, freezing sparrows, where the sparrows are a metaphor for the Lao Baixing, for the people. And other times you'll actually have an image, as I say, of a starving child. So it occurs, and some even allegory, though allegory is rare in China.
Okay, next question is long, and I'm going to truncate it a bit. It says, I was just wondering whether you could say a bit more about the notion of the people and equality in the pre-modern Chinese texts of which you spoke. Did the idea of the people entail an idea of citizenship, which would imply a type of formal equality? In particular, you often cited how the Chinese used the metaphor of parenting to describe the ruler, but the family and parenting are not usually thought of as an egalitarian form of rule. Could you say a bit about the tensions within the Chinese conception of the people?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't ever talk about the Chinese conception of the people because I don't think there is such a thing. You have, obviously Han China, Song China, Tang China, they're all different. And within those periods, there are people with different points of view. Su Longpo, I would probably classify as a fairly open-minded person, but not everyone, not all his contemporaries were as open-minded as he was. However, when you get to Song, which is when these concepts, as you mentioned, Ken, in Peter's book, he explicates some of these very sophisticated ideas. And mentioned it also, Bianhu Qimin literally says that all registered taxpayers are normatively equal under the law, which is why in China, unlike the West for the most part, farmers, a farm woman bring a suit to the magistrate's court. We even have a number of cases in which so-called bond servants, jianu, some magistrates would accept suits from these people and others would not. But though, even if they didn't, they could always go to the grievance office, the Dongwen Jianyuan, and we have a number of cases that were taken up by the Dongwen Jianyuan, which then impeached high-level officers on behalf of these bond servants. I would call these rights, they sound like rights to me, much more so than what Englishmen had for the most part in the 18th century. And remember, when Hobbes says citizen, he glosses it as subjects. He says citizens, that is to say, subjects, right? And it's clear that that's what Hobbes meant. I don't know if you have a modern notion of citizen before the American Revolution or the French Revolution. But again, by that time, they were very much aware of the fact that Chinese taxpayers had these rights that Europeans in many cases did not have. So and as for the paternalistic part, that comes from old texts like Mencius and the Book of History and before. And these are to signal the care. It's a metaphor for the care that the government is supposed to take, or the concern the government is supposed to have for the people, as if they were their children. So the reference is not that they're dumb and they have no say in the government, but I'm just going to take care of them the way they take care of their kids, because obviously they did have a say. They could go to the grievance office. A law under, let's see, Song Shenzong, I think it is. No, it's earlier. Zhenzong, Song Zhenzong passes the law that basically establishes the grievance offices. And they say both military and civil officers, the scholars and the ordinary people can all lodge complaints on any of these topics. And that includes any aspect of policy, the behavior of officials, anything that's wrong with the government. I mean, that's pretty broad. Again, it's pretty clear from my reading of English documents that 18th century Englishmen did not feel they had the right to do that, which is why they were very impressed with these things. So I think this is, I don't want to get hung up on the word. I mean, I know that citizen is considered proprietary for the West. I'm not certain I buy that, but in order to avoid the debates, I use taxpayer for min. But taxpayer really includes a number of rights that most people in the world didn't have at that time. If you read Song Dynasty court cases, the Qingmingji, it's amazing. You will be amazed at what ordinary people do when they come to the magistrate's court.
Okay, we've got one more question from the audience here, which says, thank you for your fascinating talk. The Chinese social justice writings that you listed, were they the object of backlash or even discredit during the late?
Song and Baizhi, these guys ended up in jail, really to the Enlightenment authors in that sense. And of course, Su Shi, we know, ended up in jail. So yeah, there was often backlash at their own time. These guys were sticking their out, were to fight for social justice. I think that's about that. That would be a very interesting thing. I have often wondered if Hu Shi, for example, or Chen Dexiu even knew about these things. They seem to be completely unaware of them, but I'm sure there are people in the audience who know more about this than I do. That would be a great topic for research. I confess ignorance.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. So thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and thank you, Professor Powers, for a really wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We hope that everybody enjoyed the program tonight. If you're interested in learning more about upcoming book talks that are part of the East Asia by the Book CEAS Authors Talk series, please visit the CEAS website. A link will be placed in the chat box for everybody to refer to. We also encourage you to subscribe to CEAS emails so that you receive additional information about events that are related to East Asia. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. We look forward to hosting you at the next event. And thank you again to staff for making all of this work so smoothly. And thank you, Marty, for a really wonderful talk. So good night, everybody.
And thanks, Paul.
Okay. Yes, that's right.